He gave the world What's Going On, Let's Get It On, and Sexual Healing. He had one of the most extraordinary voices in the history of popular music, 3 full octaves, a range that could move from whisper to gospel shout and back again within a single phrase. He was also a man who never escaped the house he grew up in. Not really. Not even at the height of his fame. Not even with Motown money and worldwide adulation and the love of millions of people who had never met him. The story of what happened inside the Gaye family, across 3 generations, in cramped Washington apartments, in the churches his father ruled, and finally in a house in Los Angeles that Marvin himself had bought, is the story that explains everything about the music and everything about the ending. This is the family war nobody fully knew about. Kentucky, Washington, and the man who made the house an altar. To understand what happened to Marvin Gaye, you have to start with the man who shaped him. And to understand that man, you have to go back even further to a farm in Jessamine County, Kentucky, in 1914. Marvin Pence Gaye Sr. was born on October 1st, 1914, the third of 13 surviving children, on a farm outside Lexington, Kentucky. His own father was a violent man, a man who beat his wife and his children with the consistency of someone who understood violence as a management tool rather than a failure of control. Alberta Gaye, who would eventually become Marvin Sr.'s wife, later described the household Marvin Sr. had grown up in with a phrase that landed with the weight of a summary. "Gays against gays," she said. The violence was generational, self-contained, and passed down like an inheritance nobody had asked for and nobody knew how to refuse. When he was old enough, Marvin Sr. left Kentucky and moved to Washington, D.C., drawn by religion. He had found the House of God, a Hebrew Pentecostal denomination that combined elements of Orthodox Judaism with fundamental Christianity, with its own specific calendar of observances, its own dietary laws, its own deeply serious framework of right and wrong. He became a minister. He met and married Alberta Cooper in July 1935. He settled in Washington, and he began building the family that would both be his greatest source of pride and the theatre of his most consistent cruelty. The family home was in the Fairfax Village public housing development in southeast Washington. The neighborhood was segregated, black, and poor in the specific way that mid-century American cities had organized poverty along racial lines. Marvin Sr. held a part-time position at the post office to supplement his income from the ministry. Alberta worked as a domestic. The money was limited. The rooms were small. There were eventually 5 children crowded into that space. And in those small rooms, under the authority of a Pentecostal minister who believed punishment was a form of devotion, the children's lives were organized around the management of fear. The House of God placed itself apart from mainstream American Christianity in ways that were visible and daily. The dietary laws, the Saturday Sabbath, the specific calendar of observances, all of it set the Gaye children apart from their neighbors, their classmates, the culture that surrounded them in Washington's black community. They were already on the margins in a city organized around race. Inside those margins, their father had organized a household that set them apart still further. They were different in the way that children who grow up in strictly devout households are different, not necessarily worse off, but isolated in a particular way that makes the ordinary social connections of childhood more difficult. Marvin Sr.'s religion was not the comforting kind. Pork was forbidden. Holidays that other children celebrated, Christmas, Easter, with their trees and eggs and the commercial warmth of American consumer culture, were either banned or stripped of their secular elements. Children who violated the rules were beaten. Children who didn't clearly violate the rules were beaten for reasons that weren't always legible to the children receiving the punishment. There was also something else about Marvin Sr. that complicated the household in ways his congregation didn't know about, and his children processed in silence. He was known to dress in women's clothing in private, a dimension of his identity that sat in direct contradiction to the rigid masculine authority he projected at home and in the pulpit. His wife mentioned it in later accounts. His children understood something about the atmosphere of the household that they couldn't entirely articulate. There was a quality to the instability that went beyond the religious rules and the physical punishment, a sense of a person whose public self and private self were so profoundly disconnected that the tension leaked into everything around him. Marvin Pentz Gaye Jr. was born on April 2nd, 1939. He was the second child. He sang in his father's church choir before he was old enough to understand why music made him feel the way it did. The boy with the voice they tried to break. From his earliest years, Marvin Jr. had the kind of voice that made people stop whatever they were doing. He was singing in the choir at the House of God before he was in school. He had, by the time he was 10, developed the ability to move an adult audience in ways that children's voices very rarely accomplish. The 3-octave range was already there in its early form, the capacity to reach simultaneously for the tender and the powerful, the gospel shout and the intimate whisper, the kind of voice that seems to come from somewhere beyond the person producing it. His father saw it. What Marvin Sr. did with what he saw was complicated. On one hand, the church choir was the one context where his son's talent was visibly valuable, where it reflected well on the ministry, where it confirmed the idea that God had put something special in this household. On the other hand, Marvin Sr. applied the same regime of punishment to his son's musical development that he applied to everything else. The beatings continued alongside the singing, sometimes as a consequence of a performance not meeting the standard required, sometimes for reasons that had nothing to do with music at all. The beatings were serious. In David Ritz's biography, Divided Soul, the most thoroughly researched account of Marvin Gaye's life, written with access to the family, Marvin Jr. described the physical punishment his father administered with a specificity that made clear this was not the kind of discipline that leaves no lasting marks. By the time he was 12, he said, he could not find a spot on his body that hadn't been bruised at some point. The fear, he said, organized his childhood. Waking up, not knowing what the day would bring, what rule would turn out to have been broken in some way he hadn't anticipated. What mood would transform into consequence before he could understand what had shifted. He also described the love that was tangled into all of it. This is one of the hardest things to hold in the story of Marvin Gaye and his father. That the love was real on both sides and coexisted with the harm without cancelling it. Marvin Jr. loved his father in the way that children love the people who are simultaneously necessary and dangerous to them. He wanted his father's approval with an intensity that never diminished, not in childhood, not in adulthood, not even when he had won the approval of millions of people who had never met him. The world could applaud him, and the applause could not fill the specific space his father had left empty. His mother, Alberta, was a counterbalance. She was warm and gentle and devoted to her children in ways that the documentary record consistently confirms. Marvin Jr. adored her with a completeness and simplicity that was entirely different from his relationship with his father. He described her as the person who had kept him together through the years when his father's behavior threatened to take everything apart. He would eventually write music that expressed what she meant to him. The tenderness in his voice on certain recordings has something to do with who Alberta Gaye was and what she had managed to give him in a household that was organized around a different set of imperatives. At 17, Marvin Jr. dropped out of high school and enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. The stated reason was service to his country. His actual motivation by his own later account, was escape, getting out of the house, putting physical distance between himself and his father's authority. The Air Force turned out to be its own form of confinement. The hierarchy, the rigid discipline, the inability to choose when or how he expressed himself. All of it felt uncomfortably familiar. He was discharged in 1957, having deliberately performed poorly enough to be released from service. After the discharge, he joined the doo-wop group The Marquees, and then the New Moonglows, working under the guidance of producer Harvey Fuqua. When the Moonglows dissolved and Fuqua moved to Detroit to work with Berry Gordy's Motown Records, Marvin Jr. went with him. In Detroit, he met Gordy, and in Gordy, he found the next complicated father figure in a life that was going to be full of them. Motown, Berry Gordy, and the second father. Berry Gordy had built Motown Records in Detroit into something that had no real precedent in American music. A black-owned company producing black artists for mainstream American audiences with a commercial and artistic ambition that the industry had not seen, organized this way before. The Motown operation was genuinely extraordinary. The in-house songwriting teams, the choreography coaching, the finishing school that taught artists how to present themselves on television and in front of white audiences, the quality control system where every single was reviewed before release. Gordy was a perfectionist and a businessman and a father figure to essentially every artist who came through his building on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit. By the time Marvin Gaye Jr. arrived in Detroit in late 1960, the machine was already running. The miracles were there. The Marvelettes were signed. Stevie Wonder would arrive in 1961. The Supremes were being developed. Marvin Gaye Jr. signed with Tamla, a Motown subsidiary, in 1961. He also changed the spelling of his surname to Gaye around this time, a change with multiple motivations. Partly it was a professional calculation, giving himself distance from the family name. Partly, as he later indicated, it was connected to something about the associations of the name gay in an American culture, where that word was taking on other meanings, and to his awareness of his father's private cross-dressing, which had always made the surname feel like a complicated inheritance. He also married Anna Gordy, Berry Gordy's older sister, in 1963. Anna was 17 years his senior. She was sophisticated, well-connected, and genuinely invested in the career of a young man whose talent was evident but whose path was not yet clear. She loved him, and the marriage was real in its way. But it was also caught from the beginning in the gravitational pull of the Gordy family's commercial interests, and the dynamic between Marvin and his brother-in-law/label boss Berry Gordy was never simple. Gordy was another powerful, controlling man in a life that had already been organized around powerful, controlling men. Another figure whose approval Marvin both needed and resented. His early Motown output was pop and dance music, songs designed for the radio, for the charts, for the formula that Gordy had refined into an industry. He was commercially successful almost immediately, with hits like Stubborn Kind of Fellow and Hitchhike charting in 1962, and Pride and Joy in 1963. He became a reliable name on the Motown roster. He was also, by his own account, performing material that didn't fully express what he could do or what he wanted to say. He wanted to make music that engaged with the world he was actually living in, that brought his own interior life to the surface, rather than concealing it beneath commercial arrangements. He was also watching the world outside the studio change in ways that demanded a response. By the late 1960s, the civil rights movement had transformed the country's self-understanding. Vietnam was tearing apart the political consensus. His close friend and duet partner Tammy Terrell collapsed in his arms on stage in October 1967, the first visible sign of the brain tumor that would kill her in March 1970. He had made some of the most beautiful recordings of his career with Tammy. Ain't No Mountain High Enough, Your Precious Love, Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing. And her decline and death devastated him in ways that deepened the darkness already present in his relationship with his own life and with the industry that had shaped it. He wanted to make an album that addressed all of it: the war, the deaths, the state of the country, the specific grief of his own moment. Berry Gordy, whose commercial model was pop music for mainstream audiences, did not initially want Marvin Gaye to release an album about Vietnam and poverty and the deterioration of American society. Marvin insisted, and in 1971, everything changed. What's Going On, and the music that changed everything. What's Going On was released in May 1971, and it changed what was possible in popular music. The album addressed the Vietnam War, police brutality, environmental destruction, drug addiction, poverty, and the spiritual exhaustion of a country that had been promising freedom to its black citizens for over a century, and consistently delivering something considerably less. It did all of this in music that was lush and beautiful and emotionally intelligent. Music that did not bludgeon its audience with its message, but drew them into the concern through tenderness and sorrow and the specific quality of Marvin's voice, which was doing things on this record that it had never done on a Motown pop single. The album's structure was itself a statement. It was conceived as a continuous piece of music, with one song flowing into the next, a suite rather than a collection. An approach that was unusual in commercial soul, and that reflected Marvin's insistence on being taken seriously as an artist, rather than as a hit manufacturer. He wrote or co-wrote the majority of the material. He produced significant portions of it himself. The arrangements were dense and layered in ways that rewarded repeated listening. It remains one of the most significant albums in the history of recorded music. Critics who have written about it across the decades since have described it as the moment when soul music became capable of sustaining the full weight of moral and political reality without losing its emotional power. Rolling Stone magazine has ranked it as the greatest album of all time. The description of the album as a seamless 40-minute meditation on love, grief, social injustice, and spiritual seeking became the standard language for discussing it. Language that, 50 years later, has not been superseded by anything more accurate. Berry Gordy had resisted releasing it. When he finally heard the complete record, he changed his mind, recognizing that whatever his commercial reservations had been, this was something that transcended them. The commercial success was enormous. The album and its singles dominated the charts. But more than commercial, it was a statement that Marvin Gaye was not the artist the industry had assumed him to be. He was something more difficult and more important. The success gave him leverage at Motown. He began producing his own material, taking control of creative decisions that the Motown system had previously kept in-house. He made Let's Get It On in 1973, which established him as one of the most explicit explorers of sexual and emotional intimacy in popular music. The album opened with the title track's direct and joyful declaration of desire, and everything that followed deepened that declaration. He made I Want You in 1976, produced by Leon Ware, which took the erotic territory of Let's Get It On and gave it a more dreamlike and melancholic quality. He was making records that were distinctive from one another, that pushed into different emotional terrain, that demonstrated the range of an artist who had found freedom after years of working within commercial constraints. Through all of it, the personal life was deteriorating in ways that the music could describe but not resolve. The marriage to Anna Gordy ended in divorce in 1977. Acrimonious, expensive, and complicated by the specific financial arrangements that the Gordy family had built around his career. Anna was awarded the royalties from Marvin's next album as part of the settlement. Marvin then proceeded to make Here, My Dear, a double album that was an explicit and often brutal account of the marriage's breakdown, made public as a contractual obligation and a creative act simultaneously. It was one of the strangest and most transparent albums in his catalogue, a private reckoning offered to the public without the usual distances of metaphor. He married Janice Hunter in 1977. Janice was the daughter of jazz musician Slim Gaillard and significantly younger than Marvin. Their relationship had been going on since the early 1970s, alongside the dying years of the marriage to Anna. They had a daughter, Nona, born in September 1974, and a son, Frankie Christian, born in November 1975. The marriage to Janice was passionate and deeply unstable, and ended in 1981. By the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, Marvin Gaye was in serious financial and personal trouble. The debt from the divorce settlement was enormous. The IRS was pursuing him for unpaid taxes that had accumulated over years of financial mismanagement. His cocaine use had become central to his daily existence rather than peripheral to it. He moved to Europe, to London first, then to Ostend, Belgium, to escape the creditors and the chaos. In Ostend, he lived for nearly 2 years, largely in a converted tour bus, working through his darkness. He emerged from Belgium with Sexual Healing, one of the most perfect recordings of his career, a worldwide hit, a Grammy winner for Best Male R&B Vocal Performance and Best R&B Song in 1983. The Midnight Love album that contained it was released in October 1982. He came home to Los Angeles a commercial success again. What happened in the following 16 months was the end of everything. The Return, The Darkness, and The House on Gramercy Place. Marvin Gaye returned to Los Angeles in late 1982 as a commercial success again, with a hit album and Grammy wins and the kind of professional momentum that should have pointed toward a new chapter. He mounted the Midnight Love Tour, playing to large audiences across America through 1983. He was, to the world watching, a man who had survived his worst years and emerged intact. Behind the public face, the situation was considerably darker. His cocaine use had escalated during the tour into something that people close to him described as extreme, consuming most of his available hours, distorting his perception of everything around him, producing the specific paranoia that long-term stimulant use generates in the people it grips. He had developed the belief that people were trying to harm him. Security concerns, real and imagined, structured much of his daily life. He spoke about death with an openness that his brother Frankie and others found genuinely alarming. He told people he did not expect to live much longer. He said it without apparent distress, in the flat tone of someone who has accepted something they can't change. He was also, in this period, embroiled in a renewed conflict with his father. The conflict had never fully resolved. It was the background radiation of his entire adult life. But now, Marvin had made a decision that made the conflict unavoidable in its daily dimension. He had bought his parents a house. The house on Gramercy Place in the West Adams neighborhood of Los Angeles was purchased by Marvin Gaye for his parents in the early 1980s. It was a generous act, and also, in retrospect, a decision made without full awareness of what proximity to his father would do to him in his current state. He was not merely buying his parents a comfortable home. He was placing himself in the same address as the man who had beaten him throughout his childhood during the worst period of his own psychological life. He moved into the house himself in January 1984, returning from the end of the tour and having separated from whatever other living arrangements he had maintained. He was in the same building as his father. He was using heavily. His behavior was erratic in ways that his mother found frightening, and his brother tried to manage from a distance. What happened inside that house across the early months of 1984 was documented partially by the people who were present and partially by the medical examination that followed. The arguments between Marvin and his father were serious and escalating. On at least one occasion, Marvin physically confronted his father, something that crossed a boundary that the household had maintained throughout his childhood, where the direction of physical harm had always moved in one direction only. He was a 44-year-old man who had spent his entire life absorbing his father's aggression, and something in the chemistry and paranoia of his final months had produced a terrible reversal of that dynamic. Alberta Gaye told investigators and journalists afterward that she had feared for both their lives in the days before April 1st, 1984. She described arguments of an intensity she had never experienced in their marriage. She described a household where both men seemed to be moving towards something she could see coming and could not stop. April 1st, 1984. The argument on the morning of April 1st, 1984, one day before Marvin Gaye's 45th birthday, began between Marvin Sr. and Alberta. The specific origin of the argument has been described differently by different sources. What is consistent across all accounts is that Marvin Jr. intervened, entering his parents' bedroom during the fight. What followed was a physical confrontation between Marvin Jr. and his father. Marvin Jr. struck his father and pushed him hard enough that he fell. Then Marvin Jr. left the room and returned to his own bedroom. After Marvin Jr. left, Marvin Sr. retrieved a gun, a .38 caliber revolver that had been a Christmas gift from Marvin Jr. himself the previous December. He walked down the hall to his son's room. He shot Marvin Jr. once. Then, at close range, he shot him a second time. Marvin Gaye was pronounced dead at California Hospital Medical Center at 1:01 p.m. on April 1st, 1984. He was 44 years old. It was one day before his 45th birthday. When police arrived and Marvin Gaye Sr. was taken into custody, the initial charge was first-degree murder. Before the case could go to trial, however, a medical examination of Marvin Sr. revealed something that would fundamentally alter the legal outcome. He had a brain tumor, a large, plum-sized tumor that had gone undetected and untreated, pressing on areas of the brain that regulate behavior, emotional control, and impulse management. The murder charge was reduced to voluntary manslaughter. Marvin Gaye Sr. received a 6-year suspended sentence and 5 years of probation. He served no prison time. The tumor was subsequently operated on, and by multiple accounts, the surgery produced a striking change in his personality. The post-surgical Marvin Sr. was described by people who knew him as calmer, softer, genuinely capable of remorse in ways that the man before the operation had not been. He lived until October 10th, 1998, 14 years after the death of his son. He died at the age of 84 in Culver City, California. He told interviewers in his final years that he was sorry. He said it more than once. Whether that sorry reached anything or anyone in a way that mattered is a question that belongs to the people who loved Marvin Gaye. What the music was actually saying. The biography of Marvin Gaye is also, inseparably, a biography of his music, and the two stories inform each other in ways that become clearer with time rather than less. What's Going On is about Vietnam and social injustice, yes. But listen to what is underneath those concerns. A voice asking, with genuine anguish, how human beings can continue to harm each other when they know what the harm costs. A voice that has been in rooms where harm was ambient and routine. A voice that cannot understand cruelty, even though it has been inside cruelty's house for its entire life. The title track opens with the sound of a party, people greeting each other, voices overlapping, laughter in the background, before the music settles into its plea. That contrast between the warmth of human connection and the violence that surrounds it was not a compositional choice made from a comfortable distance. It was the texture of Marvin Gaye's actual experience, transposed into arrangement. Let's Get It On is about desire and intimacy, yes. But it is also the music of a man for whom love and danger had always coexisted, for whom tenderness was always shadowed by the knowledge that the people closest to you were also the people most capable of hurting you. The yearning in the song is not only sexual, it is the yearning of someone who has never been fully certain that love is safe to receive, and who is asking for it anyway with everything he has. Sexual Healing, the song that brought him back from Belgium, the Grammy winner, the worldwide hit, is explicitly about the power of intimacy to repair damage. He had spent his career making music about connection, about the human need for contact and understanding, and the specific desperation behind that need was the product of a childhood in which connection had been systematically made dangerous by the person who was supposed to provide it most reliably. The songs are love songs. They are also something else. Dispatches from a man who needed love in the specific, overwhelming way that people need things they have always been denied. David Ritz, who wrote the biography Divided Soul with Marvin Gaye's direct cooperation in the years before his death, has described working sessions where Marvin connected his musical material explicitly to his experiences with his father, where the link between the art and the wound was made clear by the artist himself, rather than inferred by anyone outside. Ritz described an artist who understood his own psychology with uncommon clarity, who could see with considerable precision what had made him who he was, and who could not use that clarity to escape the consequences of what had been built into him. Marvin told Ritz that he had always felt divided, caught between the sacred and the secular, between the gospel singer his father had raised and the soul artist he had become, between the church and the street, between the good son and the man who had done what he needed to do to survive. He described the division as the central fact of his inner life, and it expressed itself in music that was always simultaneously transcendent and troubled, always reaching for something and never quite arriving. The reaching was the music. The not arriving was also the music. Together, they produced something that has outlasted everything that was trying to hold him down. Frankie Gaye, Marvin's younger brother, who had served in Vietnam and whose letters home had formed part of the emotional foundation of What's Going On, has spoken across the decades about what it was like to watch Marvin carry all of this. He described watching a man who was genuinely trying to make peace with something that had been put inside him before he had any defenses against it. He described watching the music be the place where Marvin could say what he couldn't say in any other form. The people he left behind. When Marvin Gaye died on April 1st, 1984, he left behind 3 children, a body of work that continues to reshape popular music across generations, and a family that has spent decades navigating the specific complexity of what happened and what it meant. His daughter Nona Gaye, born to Janice Hunter in September 1974, became a singer and actress in her own right, signing with Atlantic Records in the 1990s and releasing several albums. She has spoken about her father with love and with the honest acknowledgement of what his struggles cost him and the people who loved him. She has described growing up in the shadow of a legendary father she lost when she was 9 years old, processing the grief of that loss alongside the pride of what he made. His son, Frankie Christian Gaye, born in November 1975, also pursued music. His elder son, Marvin Pence Gaye III, was born in 1965 from the marriage to Anna Gordy and has given limited interviews across the years in which the love and the complication coexist in the way they do for children of complicated parents. Marvin's brother, Frankie Gaye, a singer himself who had served in Vietnam and whose letters home from the war had informed the emotional core of what's going on, lived with the memory of a brother who was the greatest talent their family had produced and who died in the house their famous brother had bought for their parents. Frankie spoke across many years about the period leading up to April 1984, about watching something unfold that he could see and could not stop, about a brother who was simultaneously at the height of his influence and at the lowest point of his personal life, and about the specific helplessness of caring about someone who seems to be walking towards something irreversible. Alberta Gaye, the mother whose warmth had been the counterbalance to her husband's severity throughout the family's history, the woman who had been in the house on Gramercy Place when her husband killed their son, outlived both of them. She died in 1987, 3 years after April 1st. She had 3 years to carry what had happened in that room, what she had witnessed, what the family name had produced across the generations she had seen. The posthumous honours arrived steadily. Marvin Gaye was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, 3 years after his death. He received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1990. His catalogue has been sampled and covered and cited by artists across every genre in the decades since. Hip-hop producers, pop artists, R&B singers, and musicians who are doing something entirely different from any of those categories. The influence is so embedded in American music that it is sometimes invisible, which is the specific fate of influences that are deep enough to become part of the structure rather than part of the surface. What the war was actually about. The family war nobody fully knew about was not, in the end, a war about money or music or the specific argument that happened on the morning of April 1st, 1984. Those were the final forms it took. The war had been going on since Marvin Sr. was a boy on a farm in Jessamine County, Kentucky, learning from his own father that violence was how strength expressed itself, that authority was demonstrated through harm, and that love and punishment were not separate things, but a single delivery system that the men of the Gaye family had been administering across generations without anyone naming it as the inheritance it was. Marvin Sr. carried that lesson into his ministry and his marriage and his household in Washington, D.C. He beat his children in the name of a God who he genuinely believed required severity. He loved them in the way that people who have been deeply damaged can love, partially, inconsistently, bound up with control and the need for deference in ways that made the love difficult to receive without also receiving the harm attached to it. He had not invented this. He had inherited it. It had not diminished in the transfer. Marvin Jr. absorbed all of it and made it into music. He made some of the most important music of the 20th century from the raw material of a childhood that should have produced only damage. He was, by every account of the people who knew him, a genuinely extraordinary human being. Curious, warm, spiritually searching, capable of profound tenderness alongside profound self-destruction. He wanted peace more than almost anything, and he never found it, because the war he was fighting was inside him, and it was the war his father had put there, and the only way to end a war like that is to address it directly, which neither of them had the capacity to do in the rooms where it actually lived. The tumour in Marvin Sr.'s brain may have pushed the moment of the shooting earlier than it might otherwise have arrived. But the conditions for what happened on April 1st, 1984, had been in place since the 1940s, in the cramped apartments of southeast Washington, in the moments when a man who had been beaten as a child raised his hand against his own children and called it love. Marvin Gaye's music is still everywhere, It plays in restaurants and film scores and sample-based productions across every genre and every generation that has come since. His voice is still as immediate as it was when it was recorded, still capable of stopping a room, still carrying the specific combination of yearning and sorrow and transcendence that made it unlike anyone else's. It is the voice of someone who understood, at some level deeper than knowledge, what it meant to love someone who hurt you, and to keep reaching for something better anyway. To reach so far that the reaching itself became the most beautiful thing he ever made. He was 44 years old. He was one day from 45. His father had given him the gun as a Christmas present. The music is still here. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. She was 26 years old, 8.5 months pregnant, and standing at the beginning of what everyone around her believed would be one of the great careers in Hollywood. She had the talent, the face, and the warmth that people in that business spend careers searching for. Her husband was one of the most celebrated directors in the world. Her home was a center of the most glamorous social life in Los Angeles. And on a single night in August 1969, all of it ended, not through illness, not through accident, but through a planned act of violence so senseless that the people who investigated it struggled for months afterward to understand why. The story of Sharon Tate is not only a story about what happened on that night, it is the story of who she was before it, and what the world lost when it was over. Dallas, 6 cities, and the making of a star. Sharon Marie Tate was born on January 24, 1943, in Dallas, Texas, the first of 3 daughters born to Colonel Paul James Tate and Doris Gwendolyn Willett Tate. Her father was a United States Army intelligence officer, a career that brought with it the specific pattern of life that military families know well: frequent reassignments, new cities, new schools, friendships that began and then had to be left behind as the orders arrived and the family packed again. By the time Sharon was 16 years old, she had lived in 6 different American cities. She attended South Shaver Elementary School in Pasadena, then Chief Joseph Junior High School in Richland, Washington. She was at Columbia High School in Richland before her father's transfer took the family to Texas, and then she was at Irvin High School in El Paso before the next move carried them even further from home. Each relocation meant starting over socially, finding the rhythms of a new school, navigating the hierarchies of a new peer group, building connections that might last a year before the next set of orders arrived and broke them. When her father was assigned to Verona, Italy, in 1962, Sharon attended the American high school in nearby Vicenza. She was, by this point, a teenager who had spent years being the new girl, arriving in the middle of established social circles, trying to find her place while the rest of the class had years of shared history she wasn't part of. The shyness this had produced was real. She often said later in life that people would misread her reserve as coolness or aloofness until they actually spent time with her. What was underneath, according to everyone who did get to know her, was genuine warmth, a quality of real interest in other people, and an intelligence that was not always the first thing visible behind the remarkable face. The beauty had been noticed almost from the beginning. At 6 months old, her grandmother submitted photographs to a beauty competition called Miss Tiny Tot of Dallas, and Sharon won. Her parents had no particular entertainment ambitions for their daughter. This was a military family, not a stage family. But the evidence of something unusual in her appearance was present from before she could walk. In Italy, for the first time, something opened for her socially. She was surrounded by other American children who understood the experience of being an army family living abroad, who shared the same specific displacement, who were navigating the same challenges together. She found her footing. She was crowned both homecoming queen and prom queen at the Vicenza American High School. Her photograph in a swimsuit was published on the cover of Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, and circulated with the kind of attention that confirms something to a young woman about what she carries with her. While still in Italy, she appeared as a background extra in an American film being shot on location. Adventures of a Young Man, based on Ernest Hemingway's stories, with a cast that included Paul Newman. It was practically invisible work, but it was her first time on a film set, her first encounter with how the machinery of movies actually operated. An actor in the film, Richard Beimer, noticed her among the extras and introduced himself. They dated briefly. When her father's assignment brought the family back to the United States in 1963, Sharon made a decision that the years of cautious army brat moves had never quite permitted before. She set off for California on her own initiative, heading toward Hollywood after making contact with a talent agent named Hal Gefsky. She was 20 years old. She had striking hazel eyes, a soft-speaking voice that multiple people described as uniquely warm in quality, and a face that made casting agents pause in mid-sentence when she walked into a room. Filmways, a production company, signed her to a 7-year contract. The development process that followed was standard for the era. Acting classes, television appearances designed to build recognition before the larger roles arrived. She appeared in recurring episodes of the Beverly Hillbillies, wearing a dark wig to keep her profile deliberately low. She had small parts in Petticoat Junction, Mr. Ed, and The Man from UNCLE. She was learning in the way that working actors learn, by doing it repeatedly, in front of cameras, across a range of modest situations, accumulating the specific confidence that experience provides and that no amount of classroom instruction can replicate. The people she worked with kept mentioning her afterward. Directors, co-stars, producers. The same observations surfaced consistently. Something real was there, and it was still becoming. What she was going to be had not yet fully arrived. Roman Polanski and the Life That Opened Up. The meeting between Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski in 1966 was one of those moments that look, in retrospect, like the convergence of two very different trajectories, one ascending, one already arrived. Roman Polanski was born in Paris in 1933 to Jewish parents of Polish origin, and his childhood had been shaped by experiences of such profound darkness that the shape of his adult life and his work bore their marks permanently. His mother had died in a Nazi concentration camp. He had survived the war as a child in the Krakow ghetto, sheltered by strangers and relatives, hiding and moving. He had come out of it alive and had made his way, through extraordinary talent and determination, to the centre of European cinema by the early 1960s. His film Repulsion in 1965, shot in London with Catherine Deneuve, established him as one of the most distinctive and psychologically sophisticated directors in the world. His dark sensibility had deep roots. He was directing Sharon Tate in The Fearless Vampire Killers when they met, a horror comedy in which Sharon played a young woman at the centre of the film's supernatural events. He was 32. She was 23. The people who knew them both described the connection between them as genuine on both sides. Not a power dynamic disguised as romance, but an actual meeting of two people who found in each other something they hadn't expected. He later wrote about her in language that expressed something more than customary warmth. He described the quality that made her different from other beautiful people, the complete absence in her of the self-consciousness that beauty usually produces. She didn't pose. She didn't manage how she was seen. She moved through the world, apparently unaware that her presence in a room changed the atmosphere of the room. People who knew her well, who had spent real time with her, confirmed this description from their own experience. The vanity was simply absent. What was there instead was the attention she paid to other people. Real, unglamorous, consistent attention. They married on January 20th, 1968 in London, in a ceremony attended by friends from both sides of the Atlantic. The photographs show two people in genuine happiness, surrounded by the people who mattered to them. In the months that followed, Sharon's career gained the momentum that had been building. Valley of the Dolls, the 1967 adaptation of Jacqueline Suzanne's enormously popular novel, required her to carry significant dramatic weight in a role quite different from the lighter television work she had been doing. The film became a commercial phenomenon, and Sharon received a Golden Globe nomination for New Star of the Year. The nomination was recognition of something real, not merely recognition of beauty. She had done something in that film that the people watching it could feel. The Wrecking Crew in 1968, alongside Dean Martin, demonstrated a genuine facility for physical comedy and light action that surprised people who had categorized her primarily as a dramatic presence. She moved with confidence and commitment in the film's action sequences. Her timing was good. The specific rhythmic quality that comedy requires, which cannot be entirely taught, was present in what she did. Leonard Maltin, the film critic, would later describe her work in The Wrecking Crew and Don't Make Waves as the two best indicators of the career she might have established. The two pieces of evidence that suggested the direction she was heading before the direction was cut off. The potential was documented. What was done with it was not. She and Polanski were at the center of the social world of late 1960s Hollywood. The parties, the dinners, the particular international glamour of a film director and actress who moved between Los Angeles and London and Europe with the ease of people whose work required it. She was, in these circles, the person people were happiest to see arrive. She made people feel welcomed and noticed in a way that was entirely natural, and that contrasted, in the memory of the people who experienced it, with the often more guarded or calculating social behavior that the entertainment world produced in most of its inhabitants. In late 1968, she became pregnant with their first child. She was, by all descriptions from the people around her, overjoyed in a way she made no effort to contain. She told friends about the pregnancy with unguarded happiness. The due date was expected in mid-August 1969. The house on Cielo Drive. The house at 10,050 Cielo Drive was not unusual for the social world it inhabited. Set in Benedict Canyon, in the hills above Los Angeles, it was a comfortable rental property with pleasant grounds, a main house and a guest cottage, and the specific quality of sheltered seclusion that the canyon properties of the Hollywood Hills provided. The address had previously been rented by a record producer named Terry Melcher, a figure whose connection to the house would become, in retrospect, one of the most significant details in the entire story. Sharon and Roman had moved in earlier in 1969, after their return to Los Angeles. Roman was in Europe for work in early August, preparing a production and handling professional commitments that kept him away from the house. Sharon was in the final weeks of her pregnancy, large and radiant, surrounded by friends who were staying with her or coming by regularly. On the evening of August 8th, 1969, she had guests at the house. Jay Sebring was there, her former boyfriend and close friend, a celebrated hairstylist who had become one of the most sought-after figures in the industry, styling the hair of Steve McQueen and Jim Morrison and Frank Sinatra. Abigail Folger was there, the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, a woman who had moved in the same social circles and who was in a relationship with Wojtek Frykowski, and Frykowski was there, a Polish filmmaker and writer, an old friend of Polanski's, a man whose connection to the house was through the Polanski connection. Stephen Parent had arrived separately. He was 18 years old, a friend of the property's caretaker, William Garretson, who lived in the guest cottage at the back of the property. Parent had visited Garretson to sell him a clock radio. He was leaving when what came up the driveway arrived. What came up the driveway, late that night, was 3 members of the group that surrounded a man named Charles Manson. Charles Manson and the twisted world that produced the night. Charles Manson was not the primary perpetrator in the physical sense of what happened on Cielo Drive. He was not there. But understanding what happened requires understanding what he was, and what he had created in the years that led to that night. Manson had been born in 1934, the child of an unmarried 16-year-old woman in Cincinnati, Ohio. His childhood was a sequence of abandonment, institutional care, and petty criminality that led to his first imprisonment when he was still a teenager. He spent the majority of his adult life in and out of correctional facilities, accumulating convictions for theft, car theft, forgery, and various other offenses. He had learned, across those years, to read people with the specific precision of someone whose survival depended on it. Prison gives certain people a particular education in human vulnerability, and Manson had been attending that school since childhood. By the time he was released from Terminal Island Federal Correctional Institution in March 1967, he had spent more than half his life behind bars. He reportedly told prison officials that he didn't want to leave, that the world outside was something he had never actually inhabited as a functioning adult. That institutional life was the only life he understood. His objection was overruled, and he was released into San Francisco. The timing placed him at the epicenter of the counterculture movement, at its most open and its most credulous. The Summer of Love had drawn thousands of young people to the Haight-Ashbury district, people who were looking for something beyond the conventional American life they had grown up inside, who were searching for community and meaning and a framework for understanding the world. Many of them had already partially abandoned the structures, family, religion, conventional employment, that might otherwise have given them stability. Manson was extraordinarily well suited for what this environment needed, a charismatic, articulate figure who seemed to have all the answers. He moved through the counterculture gathering followers, primarily young women, who found in him a figure who combined spiritual authority with what appeared to be genuine freedom. He was manipulative in ways so practiced and so deeply embedded in his personality that the people he was manipulating were largely unable to see it from inside the dynamic. He spoke in a mixture of genuine spiritual vocabulary and grandiose self-mythology, and the worldview he constructed was binding in the specific way of worldviews that tell you, simultaneously, that you have found the only real truth, and that everyone outside the group is unable to understand it. The group that coalesced around him, which became known after the murders as the Manson family, eventually settled at the Spahn Ranch, a former movie location property in the hills west of Los Angeles, where the elderly, nearly blind owner allowed them to stay in exchange for labor and company. The ranch had been used for decades as a location for Western films and television productions. Manson's group maintained it, worked it, and used it as the base from which his teachings and his control deepened. Terry Melcher, the record producer who had previously rented the house on Cielo Drive, had at one point made contact with Manson, whose music Manson had hoped might interest Melcher professionally. Melcher had assessed what Manson offered and declined to pursue it. Manson knew the Cielo Drive address from that period of contact. The house that Sharon and Roman had rented was the house where Melcher had once lived. By the summer of 1969, Manson was preaching what he called Helter Skelter, an apocalyptic vision of an impending race war in America, in which chaos would sweep the country and only the family, surviving in the desert, would emerge to inherit what remained. He believed, or claimed to believe, that high-profile acts of violence that could be attributed to black perpetrators would ignite this catastrophe. The murders he was planning were designed to set that fire. On the evening of August 8, 1969, he sent 3 of his followers to Cielo Drive with instructions to kill everyone inside. The 3 were Charles Watson, known as Tex, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel. August 9th, 1969. What happened at 1050? Cielo Drive in the early hours of August 9th, 1969, is documented in the trial record and in the extensive journalistic and historical investigation that followed over the subsequent decades. The account here is drawn from those documented sources. The 3 who came to the house encountered Stephen Parent at the driveway as they arrived. He was 18 years old and entirely unconnected to the Manson group's intended targets. He was leaving the property after his visit to the caretaker. He was shot and killed at the wheel of his car. Inside the house, Sharon, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojtek Frykowski were spending the evening together. The television was on. Sharon was in her nightgown. The gathering was casual. Friends at the end of a summer night, at the home of a pregnant woman whose husband was abroad. What entered the house was incomprehensible by any frame of reference available to the people inside it. Sebring, Frykowski, and Folger died in the violence that followed. Their deaths were each documented in the criminal record that came later, and the details belong to that record rather than to a video whose purpose is to honor Sharon Tate and tell her story. Sharon was the last to die. Before she died, she pleaded. She pleaded not for her own life exactly. What she pleaded for was the life of the child she was carrying. According to testimony given at the trial, she asked to be allowed to have the baby first, and that if she could have the baby first, she would willingly accept whatever happened to her afterward. She was 26 years old and 8.5 months pregnant, and she was trying to save her child. The plea was refused. Sharon Marie Tate Polanski and her unborn son, whom she and Roman had planned to name Paul Richard Polanski after her father, died in the early hours of August 9th, 1969. Her body was discovered later that morning, along with the bodies of the 4 others, by the housekeeper who arrived for work. The investigation and the revelation. The Los Angeles Police Department's investigation of the Tate murders was, in its early stages, a documented failure. The crime scene was not secured with the care that its complexity required. Evidence was handled in ways that investigators who examined the case later found troubling. Physical materials were disturbed before their significance could be fully documented. The multiple crime scenes created an additional problem, because the following night, August 9th to 10th, Manson himself drove his group to a second location, the residence of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in the Los Feliz neighborhood, and directed a separate set of killings there. The 2 crimes needed to be connected. For weeks, they were not. The investigations ran separately, accumulating information on parallel tracks that did not cross. The LAPD had received information from earlier arrests and interviews connected to the Manson group that might have pointed investigators in the right direction earlier. This information was not effectively communicated between the units that held it. This failure, the gap between information held somewhere in the system and the investigative teams that needed it, would later be examined closely by criminologists studying the case. Weeks passed without an arrest. The city of Los Angeles was gripped by the specific, generalized fear that high-profile unsolved violence produces. The sense that something terrible had happened, and no one knew why or where it might happen again. The social world of Hollywood contracted. People left for Europe or for other cities. The canyon houses that had defined the glamorous Los Angeles life of the late 1960s began to feel exposed and vulnerable in a way that changed how people felt about living in them. The break came from a direction nobody had anticipated. A group of people connected to the Manson organization were arrested in October 1969 in a sweep related to car theft from the Spahn Ranch property. During the subsequent interviews and the conversations that developed among people who were now in custody, information began to surface. Susan Atkins told another inmate, in November 1969, certain details about what had happened at Cielo Drive. That inmate came forward with what she had heard. The information was investigated and corroborated through additional interviews and research. In December 1969, 4 months after the murders, Charles Manson, Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel were charged with murder. The city and the country exhaled in the specific way that comes when a monstrous thing that had been shapeless finally has a name attached to it. The investigation also revealed, in those weeks and months, the full architecture of what Manson had built. The family's compound at the ranch, the desert camp at Barker Ranch, where some members had retreated, the specific dynamics of control and psychological manipulation that Manson had used to shape his followers over years. The picture that emerged required vocabulary the culture didn't quite have. It wasn't organized crime in a conventional sense. It wasn't a traditional cult in the religious sense. It was something that blurred multiple categories simultaneously. A charismatic authority figure who had found unusually damaged and vulnerable people and had methodically replaced their frameworks for understanding reality with his own. Linda Kasabian, who had been present at both the Tate and LaBianca crime scenes as a driver and witness, but had not participated in the violence, became the prosecution's essential witness. She was granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation and full testimony. Her account, delivered with clarity and consistency across weeks on the stand, was the human narrative that the documentary evidence required to be fully understood by a jury. Colonel Paul Tate, Sharon's father, the Army intelligence officer, had not waited for official channels. In the months between the murders and the arrests, disguised with a beard and long hair that made him unrecognizable, he spent time in the counterculture communities where the Manson group was known, gathering information through the methods his career had trained him to use. He provided what he learned to law enforcement. His daughter had been taken from him in the most incomprehensible way possible, and he responded by applying the most precise skills he had to finding the people responsible. The trial that defined an era. The trial of Charles Manson, Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel began in June 1970 and continued into January 1971. One of the longest and most widely covered trials in American legal history to that point. It ran for 9 months. The proceedings became, beyond their specific legal function, a document of what the 1960s counterculture had produced at its most extreme and most destructive. The courtroom scenes became part of the cultural record of the era in their own right. Manson and his female co-defendants appeared each day in ways calculated to demonstrate contempt for the proceedings and loyalty to each other. They shaved their heads and carved X marks into their foreheads. Manson appeared one morning having carved the X into a swastika. The supporters who gathered outside the courthouse daily were photographed endlessly. The entire atmosphere of the proceedings was one in which the defendants seemed to be performing for their followers and for history simultaneously, using the trial as a stage from which to communicate their continued allegiance to Manson's framework. Vincent Bugliosi was the lead prosecutor, a deputy district attorney who would later write Helter Skelter, which became the definitive account of the case and one of the best-selling true crime books in American history. His prosecution was meticulous and thorough, presenting a case built on witness testimony, physical evidence, and the careful reconstruction of Manson's specific psychological control over his followers. He was building an argument about the nature of influence, about how one person could direct others to act in ways they might not have acted independently, and about the criminal responsibility that direction carried. The central legal challenge was that Manson had not been physically present at the Cielo Drive murders. He had to be convicted of murder based on the theory that he had directed the killings, that his control over the perpetrators was so complete that their acts were effectively his acts. Bugliosi prosecuted this theory with a thoroughness that later legal scholars studied as a model for cases involving indirect criminal direction. Linda Kasabian's testimony, clear, consistent, and delivered with a specific quality of anguished honesty that the jury found credible, was the human narrative thread that connected the documented evidence to the full story. On January 25, 1971, Sharon Tate's 28th birthday, Manson and his co-defendants were convicted of first-degree murder. The date was coincidental, the jury having completed its deliberations when the evidence and arguments had been fully weighed. It was one of those coincidences that attaches to a case and stays there permanently in the memory of everyone who followed it. They were sentenced to death. In February 1972, the California Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty as then applied was unconstitutional, and the sentences were automatically commuted to life in prison. Charles Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Susan Atkins came before the parole board repeatedly over the following decades and were denied release each time. Susan Atkins died in prison in September 2009. Charles Manson died in prison in November 2017, having been denied parole 11 times. Charles Watson and Patricia Krenwinkel remained in custody as of the time of this writing. What she left and what was lost. Sharon Tate was 26 years old when she died. She had been making films for approximately 6 years and had accumulated a body of work that, while modest in quantity, showed consistent growth and an emerging range that her colleagues found genuinely impressive. The Golden Globe nomination for Valley of the Dolls was recognition of something real, not a publicity gesture, not the industry rewarding a famous face, but the specific recognition of a performance that had surprised people who came to the film expecting only a decorative presence. She had carried scenes. She had communicated internal experience through the particular discipline of film acting, which has no room for stage projection and no tolerance for performance that doesn't have something behind it. The work in The Wrecking Crew and Don't Make Waves demonstrated a gift for physical comedy and light action that was genuinely unusual. She moved with confidence and committed completely to the physical requirements of the material. Her timing was reliable. Leonard Maltin, one of the more rigorous film critics to examine her career in retrospect, identified those two films as the best indicators of the career she might have established. The two pieces of evidence that most clearly suggested the direction things were heading. Roman Polanski, who was not a director inclined toward easy praise, described her talent as something that was still in the process of developing when she died. He used language that suggested not a career cut off at its peak, but one cut off well before its peak, one that had not yet had the opportunity to fully express itself. In his telling, what was lost on August 9, 1969, was not the actress she had been, but the actress she was in the process of becoming. The people who knew her personally, directors, co-stars, friends, neighbors, the wide social network that she had built from the army brat's unlikely foundation, have returned, consistently, and across decades of interviews and memoirs, to the same description of what she was off-screen. She was genuinely warm. She was genuinely interested in the people around her. She made people feel noticed and valued in a way that was real rather than performed. In a world organized around performance and image management, where warmth is frequently a professional tool rather than a personal quality, the consistency of this description across such a wide range of independent sources is itself a document of something. Roman Polanski made films for decades after her death. Chinatown in 1974, Tess in 1979, The Pianist in 2002. He carried the loss through all of it. He described August 9th, 1969 in his autobiography as the day his life ended in one sense and continued in another. A wound that time had not healed in the ways that grief is supposed to heal. He was in London when it happened. He flew back to Los Angeles. The airport footage of his arrival, the man walking through the terminal having just received the news, is one of those images from that era that says, in a single frame, what real grief looks like when it has no performance in it. What her mother did with the grief. The story of Sharon Tate does not end on August 9th, 1969. One of its most important chapters was written in the decades that followed by a woman who transformed her grief into action that changed the law. Doris Tate, Sharon's mother, attended the trial. She watched the proceedings every day with a composed intensity that people present in the courtroom described as formidable. She was there for the testimony. She was there for the arguments. She was there for the verdict. After the convictions, after the sentences, after the years had begun to pass, she kept attending, this time to the parole hearings that the convicted killers could request. The California law of the time did not give victims' families any formal role in the parole process. Hearings took place, and families were not present and had no official standing to be heard. Doris Tate found this unacceptable. She attended anyway, fighting for informal access, speaking against release whenever she could find a means to speak. She testified. She organized. She communicated her position through every channel available to her, and she worked with other victims' families who were confronting the same absence of legal standing. Her advocacy was sustained over years, conducted during the period of her own grief, while she was still processing the loss of her daughter and unborn grandchild. She appeared before committees. She gave interviews. She coordinated with legislators who were sympathetic to the idea that crime victims and their families deserved a formal voice in the proceedings that affected them directly. In 1982, California passed the Victims' Bill of Rights, a measure that gave crime victims and their families formal standing in the legal process, including the right to attend and speak at parole hearings for those convicted of crimes against them. Doris Tate had been one of the central forces driving the advocacy that produced it. The law gave a voice to people who previously had none, who had been required to stand outside the rooms where consequential decisions were being made about the people who had harmed them and their families. Sharon Tate's biographer, Greg King, described her legacy with a precision that the Tate family endorsed. Sharon's real legacy lies not in her films. The most lasting thing she left behind is the change her mother built from grief. The law that says a victim's family has standing, that their presence matters, that what happened to them is part of the record that decisions must take into account. Doris Tate died in July 1992. Her daughter, Patty Tate, continued the advocacy work until her own death later that same year. Colonel Paul Tate, Sharon's father, the man who had disguised himself to investigate his own daughter's murder, who had sat through the trial and watched the convictions arrive, lived until 2005. The house at 10,050 Cielo Drive was demolished in the 1990s. A new structure was built on the land. The address was changed. The people who purchased the property wanted it to be, as much as possible, simply a place where someone lived rather than a destination for people who came because of what had happened there. Sharon Tate deserved to grow old. She deserved to meet her son. She deserved the career that was still becoming when it was ended. The shy army brat who had moved 6 times before she was 16, who had found warmth and confidence, and who had made of herself something genuinely remarkable. She deserved considerably more time to find out how far that could go. The crime that ended it shocked Hollywood. The woman it ended deserved considerably more than what the crime gave her. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. What she deserves to be remembered for. Sharon Tate has spent more than 5 decades being remembered primarily as a victim, as the most famous name associated with one of the most famous crimes of the 20th century. This is, on one level, accurate and inevitable. What happened to her on August 9th, 1969, was an event of historical significance, and the coverage it received and continues to receive is not without justification. But the people who knew her have consistently pushed back against the reduction of her life to her death. They have described a woman who was in the process of becoming something considerable, an actress who had barely touched the surface of her range, a person of genuine character and warmth, a woman who was about to become a mother and who was approaching that moment with a joy that the people around her found entirely contagious. She had grown up as a shy army brat, moving every year, making and leaving friends, learning to navigate new environments with the adaptability that military children develop, but that cost something in the process. She had transformed that shy, uncertain girl into a woman who was known, above all, for her warmth toward other people. That transformation was her own work, not the product of her beauty, or her fame, or her marriage to a celebrated director. It was what she had made of herself. She was 26 years old and 8.5 months pregnant, and she asked to be allowed to have her baby. In that moment, she was not a movie star. She was a mother trying to save her child. The human fact of that request, its simplicity, its total prioritizing of the life she was carrying over her own, is the thing that the people who have studied this case over the decades return to again and again as the most unbearable part of the story. She should be remembered as she was, genuinely beautiful, genuinely warm, genuinely talented, and in the middle of a life that was just getting to its most interesting part. The crime that ended it shocked Hollywood. The woman it ended deserved considerably more than what the crime gave her. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.